Welcome to Unsolved Cases, brought to you by Skoob. I'm your host, Larry Hunter, and today we're diving into a case that shattered a small town, divided a nation, and left a permanent scar on the American justice system. This is the haunting story of the West Memphis Three, a case of brutal murder, public panic, and a trial many now believe was more about fear and bias than facts and truth. Picture this. It's May 1993 in West Memphis, Arkansas. Three 8-year-old boys, Stevie Branch, Christopher Byers, and Michael Moore, vanish after school. Their bodies are later found in a drainage ditch, tied with their own shoelaces, showing signs of severe injuries and suspected mutilation. The town is stunned. Fear and anger ripple through the community, and cries for justice grow louder by the hour. But what happened next would spark decades of debate. Within months, three local teenagers, Damian Eccles, Jesse Miskelly Jr., and Jason Baldwin, were arrested and charged with the murders. Labeled as outcasts, accused of satanic rituals, and condemned by a wave of media-fueled hysteria, these boys would become known to the world as the West Memphis Three. Today, we peel back the layers of one of the most controversial cases in modern American legal history. We'll examine the evidence, the confessions, the courtroom drama, and the cultural climate that may have led to a devastating miscarriage of justice. So settle in, because today we're exploring the fear, the frenzy, and the fallout from one of America's darkest and most debated murder cases. Let me introduce you to the accused. Damian Eccles, 18 years old, was the supposed ringleader, according to prosecutors. He was sentenced to death and would spend the next 18 years in the Varner Unit Supermax, locked down 23 hours a day in a concrete tomb. Imagine that for a moment. Barely an adult, confined to a space smaller than most people's bathrooms, waiting to die for a crime he maintained he never committed. Jesse Miskelly received life in prison, plus two 20-year sentences. Jason Baldwin got life without the possibility of parole. These weren't hardened criminals. They were teenagers who had the misfortune of being different in a place where different meant dangerous. But what made them different? They wore black clothes. They listened to Metallica. In the conservative South of the early 1990s, this was apparently enough to mark them as devil worshippers. The prosecution built their case on what they called satanic ritual murder, feeding into the satanic panic that had gripped America throughout the 1980s and early 90s. Years later, when Eccles was asked about entering prison, he described being in a state of shock and trauma, barely able to put one foot in front of the other. He compared being sentenced to death for a crime he didn't commit to being repeatedly punched in the head. His original execution date was set for May 5, 1994. Think about that. Less than a year from arrest to scheduled execution. What sustained him through those 18 years? Books. He read thousands of them, until his eyesight began to deteriorate from the fluorescent prison lighting. Then, he had to limit himself to nonfiction books that could help him survive daily life in that concrete hell. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of his time on death row wasn't his own suffering. It was witnessing the executions of 25 to 30 other inmates, seeing men stabbed repeatedly, enduring severe beatings, and watching a man who had been burned with homemade napalm. Yet even in this nightmare, Eccles discovered something unexpected: solidarity. Death row had its own code. As he explained, the inmates were united against a common enemy and didn't have the luxury of fighting among themselves. They were all battling against those trying to execute them. Now let's talk about what really sealed the fate of these three teenagers: Jesse Miskelly's confession. This wasn't just any confession. This was the prosecution's golden ticket, their smoking gun that would convince a jury that three local boys were capable of unthinkable evil. But here's what makes this confession so troubling. Jesse Miskelly had an IQ of 72, putting him in the borderline intellectually disabled category. He was questioned for 12 hours, with only the final 45 minutes recorded. What happened in those other 11 hours and 15 minutes? We'll never know. But what we do know is that when the tape finally started rolling, Miskelly gave a statement filled with inconsistencies and contradictions. During the trial, prosecutor John Fogelman presented this confession in a calm, emotionless voice, letting it speak for itself. Meanwhile, defense attorney Dan Stidham desperately tried to highlight the contradictions, the absence of physical evidence, anything that might create reasonable doubt. His closing argument was haunting. The only act worse than a human killing another is the state executing an innocent man. But prosecutor Brent Davis had the last word, and he used it like a weapon. In a display of prosecutorial theater, he stood behind 16-year-old Jesse, held up a picture of victim Michael Moore over the defendant's head, and told the jury with passionate fury, he hunted him down like a beast and brought him back. As a result, Michael Moore, Stevie Branch, and Chris Byers are dead. The jury took less than a day to decide. They found Miskelly guilty of first-degree murder for Michael Moore's death and second-degree murder for the deaths of Christopher Byers and Stevie Branch. While this meant the death penalty was off the table, 17-year-old Jesse was sentenced to life without parole, plus 40 years. Interestingly, juror Lloyd Champion later admitted that the allegations of occult involvement didn't influence their verdict. Frankly, the existence of a cult wouldn't have mattered to us, he told reporters. Instead, they focused on what they saw as spontaneous details in Jesse's confession, details that the police allegedly hadn't prompted. Champion also revealed something chilling about why the defense didn't put Jesse on the stand. I believe the prosecutor could have easily torn him apart and made him say anything. While Jesse's case was built on a questionable confession, Damien Echols faced a different kind of prosecutorial strategy, one that would ignore crucial evidence about his mental state while simultaneously using his psychological struggles against him. Here's what the jury never fully understood. Damien Echols was severely mentally ill. We're not talking about teenage angst or rebellious behavior. This was a young man who had attempted suicide, experienced hallucinations and paranoid delusions, and had been committed to psychiatric hospitals 3 times in the year before his arrest. The Social Security Administration had declared him 100% mentally disabled before his trial even began. But somehow, this critical information was either minimized or completely overlooked by his defense team. Defense attorney Mallett later revealed the extent of the evidence that could have changed everything. Detailed notes documenting Damien's suicide attempt, extensive records of his mental health treatment, documentation of his disability status. In fact, his original attorney, Price, later admitted in an affidavit that knowing about the Social Security disability determination would have significantly changed his approach to representing Damien. Instead of presenting Damien as a troubled young man who needed treatment, the defense found themselves fighting an uphill battle against a prosecution that painted him as the mastermind of a satanic murder plot. The prosecution even brought in a forensic dentist to examine potential bite marks on the victims, marks that were ultimately determined not to be human bite marks at all. But the damage was done. The suggestion of ritualistic violence had been planted. Mallett later filed extensive appeals, including a writ of error coram nobis, arguing that Damien should never have been tried due to his mental condition. He criticized the original defense team's handling of the case, from their decision to seek funding from filmmakers rather than the court, to their alleged misappropriation of money from film contracts, to their failure to adequately address Damien's psychological state. Judge Burnett disagreed with these arguments and denied Damien's petition for a new trial. But the questions raised about his mental health would continue to haunt the case for years to come. Just when you think this case couldn't get more bizarre, enter the mysterious bloody knife. Picture this. It's December 19th, 1993, 6 days before Christmas. John Mark Byers, stepfather of victim Christopher Byers, casually hands over a knife to documentary filmmakers. Not just any knife, a knife with what appeared to be blood on it. The timing couldn't have been worse for the defense. They were already deep into trial preparations, and suddenly this piece of evidence emerges that hadn't been disclosed to them. The knife was sent to Byers by the filmmakers, and the very next day, police searched both Byers's and victim Todd Moore's residences. Coincidence? Defense investigator Ron Lax certainly didn't think so. But here's where it gets really interesting. The defense attorneys weren't informed about this knife for nearly a month, and only after Jesse Miskelly's trial had already begun. When the knife finally came back from the lab, the results were shocking. The blood on it was consistent with Christopher Byers, the mutilated victim, John Mark Byers's own stepson. This created an impossible situation for the defense. They had spent months preparing their case without considering Byers as a potential suspect. Now, suddenly, they had physical evidence that could point to the victim's own stepfather. But they were hamstrung by the prosecution's failure to disclose crucial information about Byers, including his work as a drug informant and his conviction for threatening to kill his ex-wife. The FedEx packaging that could have confirmed when the knife was actually discovered was mysteriously discarded. Detective Gitchell claimed the knife was received on January 8th and immediately sent for testing, but the timeline raised serious questions. Had the police known about this knife earlier? Had they deliberately withheld it from the defense? For defense attorneys Stidham and Crow, already engrossed in Jesse's trial, this discovery created a terrible dilemma. Should they present the knife as evidence, thereby suggesting reasonable doubt about their client's guilt? Or would it backfire and make their client look even more suspicious? The knife represented everything wrong with this case. Critical evidence appearing at the last minute, inadequate disclosure by the prosecution, and defense attorneys forced to make impossible decisions with incomplete information. Fast forward to 2005, and modern DNA technology began to tell a very different story about what happened in those woods in West Memphis. The results would shake this case to its very foundation and expose investigative failures that had persisted for over a decade. Here's what the DNA testing revealed. None of the genetic material found at the crime scene matched Damian Eccles, Jesse Miskelly, or Jason Baldwin. Not a single trace. After years of these three men sitting in prison, science was telling us they weren't there. But the DNA did reveal something else. Something that would have been shocking if anyone had been paying attention. 2 hairs found at the crime scene couldn't be matched to the victims. One was discovered in the ligature used to bind Michael Moore. Another was found on a tree stump at the scene. These were the only pieces of physical evidence that potentially linked an outside party to the crime. And here's where the story takes another disturbing turn. Remember Terry Hobbs, stepfather of victim Stevie Branch? Well, it turns out that in all the years of investigation, all the interviews, all the scrutiny of everyone connected to these boys, Terry Hobbs had never been questioned by police. Not once. Think about that for a moment. The stepfather of one of the victims, someone who was close to the children and present during critical hours, somehow evaded basic scrutiny for over a decade. When lead investigator Gary Gitchell was asked about this years later, he claimed he couldn't remember if Hobbs had ever been interviewed. There was no documentation supporting that any such interview ever took place. Hobbs himself insisted he had never been questioned by law enforcement. This wasn't just an oversight. This was investigative malpractice. Police had compiled a list of 29 credible suspects during the initial investigation. All of them provided blood, saliva, and hair samples for testing. Several, including John Mark Byers and Todd Moore, were thoroughly investigated. But Terry Hobbs? He fell through the cracks completely. Defense investigator Ron Lax, who had worked on this case since 1993, admitted that even he had failed to realize that Hobbs had never been interviewed. It took the DNA evidence from 2005 to finally shine a light on this massive blind spot in the investigation. By 2007, the defense team was increasingly focused on Terry Hobbs as a viable alternative suspect. Statistically, there was roughly a 1 in 5 chance that one of the 5 men most often speculated about could have been involved in the crime. But only now, 14 years after the murders, was anyone seriously looking at the stepfather of one of the victims. In 1996, everything changed for the West Memphis Three when HBO premiered a documentary that would transform their case from a local tragedy into a national cause célèbre. Paradise Lost did something unprecedented. It made viewers question not just the guilt or innocence of 3 convicted murderers, but the entire system that had put them behind bars. The documentary was intimate and powerful, showing not just the legal proceedings, but the human faces behind this tragedy. Director Joe Berlinger later admitted something that would become controversial. He sympathized more with the accused's families than the victims' families. The victims' families had actually believed the film would advocate for their murdered children, not their convicted killers. But Paradise Lost told a different story. It suggested that 3 teenagers had been convicted not based on evidence, but because they wore black clothes, listened to Metallica, and didn't fit into the conservative Christian community of West Memphis. The film introduced terms like satanic panic and drew comparisons to the Salem witch trials. The documentary's impact was immediate and profound. Berlinger estimated that 80% of viewers came away believing in the trio's innocence. Suddenly, this wasn't just about 3 dead children and 3 convicted teenagers. It was about prejudice, about how we treat those who are different, about whether justice really exists for those who don't conform. The film particularly scrutinized John Mark Byers, portraying him as unstable and potentially dangerous. When asked directly about the guilt of the convicted men, Berlinger offered a nuanced response. While they might be guilty, the court had not proven their guilt appropriately. He recalled meeting Damien Echols and being convinced of his innocence within the first 5 minutes. Berlinger was harsh in his criticism of how the case had been handled, blaming what he called fundamentalism, shoddy journalism, poor police work, and a narcissistic defendant for the outcome. He saw his film as a way to counteract media hype and community prejudice. But the documentary came too late to help the West Memphis Three in court. The verdicts were already 2 years old when it aired. What it did do was create a movement. Suddenly, celebrities, musicians, and activists were taking up their cause. Musician Henry Rollins and Black Flag released a benefit album titled Rise Above 24 Black Flag Songs to benefit the West Memphis Three. Legal experts began offering support to defense attorneys. The case became a cultural phenomenon, inspiring additional documentaries, books, and films. Peter Jackson, the director of Lord of the Rings, even co-produced a follow-up documentary called West of Memphis with Damien Echols himself. Even in the darkest circumstances, human connection finds a way to flourish. While Damien Echols sat on death row, facing execution for a crime he maintained he didn't commit, he found something he never expected: love. Damien's relationship with his future wife began while he was imprisoned, a love story that defied the brutal reality of his situation. Their connection was so profound that in 2014, they co-authored a book about their relationship titled Yours for Eternity, a love story on death row. Think about the strength it takes to build a life, to plan a future, when that future might be cut short by the state. In 2012, Damien published his autobiography, Life After Death, giving the world an intimate look at what it means to live under sentence of execution. These weren't just legal documents or case files. These were deeply personal accounts of how the human spirit survives in impossible circumstances. The hardest part of his time on death row, Echols revealed, wasn't the physical conditions, the isolation, or even the fear of execution. It was knowing he was innocent. Imagine carrying that knowledge every single day for 18 years. The absolute certainty that you're being punished for something you didn't do, while the real killer remains free. His favorite way to pass time was reading. Over the years, he consumed thousands of books, using literature and learning as an escape from the concrete walls and steel bars that confined his body. As his eyesight deteriorated under the harsh fluorescent lighting, he had to become more selective, focusing on non-fiction that could help him survive his daily reality. This wasn't just about one man's survival. It was about maintaining humanity in an inhumane system. While politicians debated the death penalty in abstract terms, Damien lived with its reality every single day. By 2007, the case had entered a new phase. Fresh forensic evidence was presented to the court, DNA evidence that would fundamentally challenge everything the prosecution had argued 14 years earlier. This wasn't about legal technicalities or procedural errors. This was about science, cold and objective, speaking louder than any witness testimony or circumstantial evidence. The DNA results were unambiguous. None of the genetic material found at the crime scene matched any of the three convicted men. After years of imprisonment, after Damien spending nearly 2 decades on death row, science was telling us they weren't there when those children died. In 2010, the Arkansas Supreme Court ruled that this new DNA evidence could be considered a crucial legal victory that opened the door for the men's eventual release. But it had taken far too long. By then, Damien had spent 18 years in solitary confinement. Jesse and Jason had spent nearly 2 decades behind bars, and the real killer had potentially been free all that time. The legal system moved slowly, but the science was clear. These 3 men had been convicted based on fear, prejudice, and false confessions, not physical evidence. The DNA evidence didn't just suggest they were innocent, it proved they weren't at the crime scene. But here's the bitter irony. Even with this scientific evidence, the state of Arkansas wasn't prepared to simply admit they had made a mistake. Instead, the resolution would come through a legal maneuver that allowed everyone to save face, while ensuring these men could never sue for their wrongful conviction. On a day in 2011 that should have been a celebration of justice, the West Memphis Three walked out of prison under what's called an Alford plea. This legal mechanism allowed them to maintain their innocence while pleading guilty, a contradiction that perfectly summarized the entire case. Damien Echols, after 18 years on death row, was finally free. Jesse Miskelly and Jason Baldwin, after nearly 2 decades in prison, could start rebuilding their lives. But this wasn't the vindication they had hoped for. The Alford plea meant they couldn't sue the state for their wrongful conviction. It meant that, officially, they were still considered guilty, even though the DNA evidence suggested otherwise. Think about what was lost in those 18 years. Damien missed his entire young adulthood, confined to a cell smaller than most bathrooms. Jesse and Jason lost their 20s, their 30s, the years when people typically build careers, start families, create the foundation of their adult lives. They got their freedom, but they could never get those years back. The real tragedy is that 3 children, Stevie Branch, Christopher Byers, and Michael Moore, are still dead, and their killer may never be brought to justice. The investigation focused so intensely on 3 teenagers who fit the profile of what investigators thought killers should look like, that the real perpetrator may have escaped accountability entirely. This case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about our justice system. How do we balance the community's demand for swift justice with the need for thorough investigation? How do we protect society from our own prejudices and fears? How do we ensure that being different doesn't become a crime punishable by death? The West Memphis Three case has become a symbol of everything that can go wrong when fear overwhelms facts, when prejudice masquerades as justice, when the system designed to protect the innocent instead destroys them. It's a reminder that in our quest for justice, we must never forget that the most important principle is not convicting someone, anyone, for a horrible crime. It's convicting the right someone. That's it for this episode of Unsolved Cases. brought to you by Skoob. I'm your host, Larry Hunter, and as always, thanks for stepping into the shadows with us. If you want to dive deeper into the evidence, the interrogations, and what experts now believe may have happened, download the Skoob app, available now on the Play Store and App Store. We've got exclusive content, case files, and expert interviews waiting for you. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and remember, not every mystery stays buried.